I was genuinely looking forward to talking about A Boy and His Buzzard ever since I heaved it out of a haul of tapes I got my hands on earlier this year. The cover and title alone sold me on the film, and I was certain that I'd struck awkward, good, bad gold with this one. It looks like the kind of buddy kids film that's just begging for awkward dialogue, poor effects, and a grand and stupid adventure. Fertile ground, really, for a total flop. Only adding to my intrigue, there's minimal information for it online, and the VHS cover for this one is pretty much non-existent on the internet, barring the copy that I hold myself. I wanted to cover this one as soon as I possibly could, and with my obligations to all things Halloween now quite firmly out of the way, I finally decided to crack this one open and give it a go. So, is A Boy and His Buzzard a forgotten cult classic? No. Absolutely not. No, 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 1,000 times no, and one more no just for good measure. A Boy and His Buzzard, which is also known as Buzzard, which is also known as Charlie and the Talking Buzzard, is a 1979 trudge through the day-to-day happenings of a child sociopath. That's not even an understatement. The film's main character, Charlie, is an out-and-out sociopath, and a fairly irredeemable one at that. I thought going into this that it was an Australian film, maybe some late 70s TV movie or something. My reasoning wasn't unfounded. My VHS release is an Australian tape, but the film itself is American. And I need to take a moment here to read you the synopsis from the back of the box for two reasons. First, to actually compare it to what actually happens in this film, and secondly, because for an official commercial release that has a barcode and everything, it's arguably one of the worst spell-check tapes I have in my collection. So, without further ado, Charlie and his two best friends, a collie dog and a buzzard, has an adventurous time in a small town in the Arizona desert. With Buzzard having problems flying and landing, things look complicated enough, until Charlie overhears a discussion between three men, and one is the town mayor. They are making a plan to steal the powder from the local fireworks factory. They hope this will close the factory down. After trying to tell his parents and friends who don't believe him, he sets out to foil the plot himself. Now that's some very poor grammar, but that aside, this isn't entirely inaccurate. Yes, there is a scheme involving the mayor and some thugs to close down a local fireworks factory, and yes, Charlie tries to foil their plan. But what the back of the box fails to mention is just how much of this film revolves around that plot point. Bearing in mind that this film has a 64-minute runtime, the first 31 minutes, 50% of the film, could be surmised as follows. A buzzard lands and tells us that Charlie has moved to the town recently. This buzzard may or may not be able to speak to humans. It's not made all that clear, and there's only one scene where he speaks to a human, and it never happens again. The buzzard then spends the rest of this film as the narrator. And my God, he's an irritating buzzard. His quips aren't funny, he talks too much and way too quickly, and frankly, without the buzzard's narration, this film would only fall further into the realms of psychological horror. This is all within the first 5 to 10 minutes of the film. The 20 minutes that follow this then follow Charlie and his dog, who's called Nothing. That was the first red flag to me, as they get bullied by some local kids who won't let them join in a game of football. And the rest of the runtime is dedicated to Charlie walking around aimlessly, going to hang out in his clubhouse, which is booby-trapped with collapsing ladders, noisemakers, and the ability to slam and open the entrance doors from a distance, and very little else. Charlie collects and reads trashy pulp horror novels, another red flag for me. And considering that this film implies that he's looking to make friends, the one time any kids do try to get into his clubhouse, he scares them off. In fact, when the thieves do turn up, the film changes gears and almost immediately stalls, with the following 34 minutes being a mashup of Charlie walking around with his dog, walking through a town and meeting the old Buzzard man, a tall and menacing-looking stranger who turns out to have a heart of gold, and streaking in front of his mum's tea party friends. Another red flag on the sociopathy scale for me. The film has a happy ending with a slightly bittersweet tinge to it. Arguably, it's one of the more predictable elements of the film. And that's it. That's the whole film in a nutshell. I sat through 64 minutes of this utter dross and I finished this film bitterly disappointed by it. I have a lot of patience for bad movies. I really do. But one thing I absolutely don't have the patience for is a boring movie. And this movie is boring. I have sat through more lively wakes than this. I'm not kidding either. Kicking things off, the direction is flat, uninspiring, and drearily dull. It's the most generic kind of made-for-TV late 70s fodder. Everything has a flat profile, there's little to no colour or stylisation in this, and the one or two shots that do rise above mediocrity are at best meh-worthy. There's only one shot in this film that's genuinely memorable, and it's a shot of Charlie trying to smile. It's one of the creepiest shots I've seen, and quite frankly it beats some horror-scary moments for just how unnerving it is. Other than that, and a brief semi-music video of Charlie and his dog walking through rows of trees to a folky soundtrack, there's absolutely nothing of interest here. It's a frankly uninspired drudge through the motions, and considering that a good chunk of this is set in the desert, it couldn't have left me feeling any colder if it tried. Equally, the cinematography is pretty much lifeless. There's almost no feeling behind the shot structures. It's all an autopilot affair. There are no standout shots, there's no real structure to it, and nothing particularly looks good. The whole thing's just bland. I wouldn't have minded so much had there at least been some colour or flair in this film, but I really cannot stress just how uninteresting this film is to look at. It's almost insufferable. And when an already short film can make it feel like you've just sat through it for a few days, you know you've screwed up somewhere. Even the soundtrack's dull. It just screams generic 70s funk. It was one of the first things I picked up on in order to date this film, because it sounds so of its time after the first two track pieces played. I immediately just sat up and said, this was a film made in the late 70s. And goddammit if I wasn't on the money with that. It's the kind of music I imagine would have played in supermarkets up and down the country at that time. It's bland, unmemorable, and what makes it even worse is that someone thought that the music was good enough to warrant having a solo spot right in the middle of the film, exclusively for an artist to showcase one of their songs. It's not painful to listen to, it's more than competent, it's just, well, dull. Total white noise music, if there ever was some. While on the subject of audio, I also need to say that while the sound recording for the most part is pretty clean, there are quite a few instances where it appears that the audios have been screwed up. There's a lot of warble. Sometimes characters' vocals just drop off. There's a hell of a lot of hiss at points. This is far from a clean recording. Whether this is just a dubbing fault or whether the production's always sounded like this, I can't personally say. But yeah, it doesn't help this film's already precarious state. The script's lifeless, samey and wishy-washy. You'd think the thieves would be the biggest plot point in the movie, but we don't really get to know them as characters, and because we aren't introduced to the mayor until about 31 minutes into this film, and even then it's not much of an introduction, more, here's the mayor now. When he turns out to be a bad guy, I didn't really care. There was no shock horror moment. It's almost like the film doesn't really know how to deal with malicious elements, so it just tries to play it down. The second biggest plot this film has is Charlie trying to play football and make some friends with some local boys. He goes so far as to go and buy a brand new ball just so he can draw the attention of the boys who are playing with a slightly broken ball. As a kid, I'm sure that seems perfectly reasonable, but as an adult, it seems very weird that a kid would go to all that trouble to try and force himself on an existing group of friends. It's also never made entirely clear where Charlie is getting all his money from either. Though based on some genuinely disturbing elements of his character, all I can say is, don't go into the crawl space alone. And those are the best plot points this script has. The dialogue's stale and feels very robotic. There's no life behind any of the dialogue, and while I don't like to tar the entire cast with the same brush, they're all terrible. Every single performance in here, with maybe the exception of Old Man Buzzard, is just awful. Genuinely awful. Probably the best example of this is when the thieves turn up for the first time and the mayor literally explains their entire plan in detail with the full outcome and everything, all in one pretty much unbroken monologue, and then they just crack on with the plan. It's just terrible. And sometimes they don't even bother giving the cast lines. Instead, they just have the Buzzard narrate exposition to help paper over the cracks. And not helping matters, the director, Christopher Kane, has seemingly either only got the budget for one take of each scene, or didn't think retakes mattered. This is because the cast fumble over so many lines in this script, it feels like the film's pretty much entirely made up of outtakes. It's a joke. A very awkward, badly delivered joke. Christopher One Take Kane has a pretty unmemorable directorship. Probably his biggest credit is that he directed The Next Karate Kid. Other than that, he has a small string of B-movie pictures to his name, but nothing standout and nothing memorable. He has even less writing credits, and again, nothing memorable to show for it. While I have been told that his work has improved in the 40-ish years since the film's completion, as a first impression, I'll be quite happy if I never see another film of him ever again. A Boy and His Buzzard was released in 1979, initially by Modern Packaging Incorporated. It was then later released on VHS by Silver Screen Promotions, and I literally cannot find any information about this release. It's really weird. There's no dates at all on the box or the tape, and an internet search has only brought up an eBay listing and an IMDb page that talks about the film. And since then, this film's never been seen again since. With good reason. The print quality is pretty poor in fairness. It's very washed out, there are notable print faults in places, and you can see the cigar burns more often than not. The audio is tinny and poor quality, and one of the things that made me smirk a bit is that the Silver Screen Promotions logo isn't a digital logo. Someone's printed their logo onto some card and then stuck it in front of a video camera. I also can't find any information about Silver Screen beyond this release, so I have to assume we're dealing with a very small, possibly localised distribution company who had very few, if any, releases beyond this one. As a result, while I can't claim this is an oddity, it certainly seems like quite a unique find. A Boy and His Buzzard has almost nothing going for it. Even the title is misleading. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that 2 out of its 3 alternative titles are misleading as well. Charlie and the Buzzard only meet fleetingly. The Buzzard doesn't belong to Charlie in any capacity apart from 1 or 2 scenes where they directly interact, and the majority of the film couldn't have Charlie and the Buzzard further apart if it tried. What this film should have been called is Charlie and the Buzzard Man, because at least that would have been both more accurate and a bit snappier, I think. But the title of this film is the least of its troubles. This is a terrifically dull movie. There's so little actually happening that I'd be conservative in saying that at least 80% of this movie is either Charlie and his dog Nothing, I still can't believe he called his dog Nothing, walking around aimlessly, or the pair just watching and playing football. The script's tone and humour fail to land, the jokes are poor quality and badly delivered, the script feels like it was written for very young children, but deals with themes that only older children would really get. And I'm not talking 12 to 13-year-olds here. I mean that this script plot-wise is written for 4 to 5-year-olds, but the dialogue is written for 8 to 10-year-olds. It's uneven, lumpy, and it enjoys its own company so much that it forgets the most important part of a movie is to entertain, engage, and actually have a point. I'd tell you to avoid this film, but the fact that it's pretty much out of print with very little chance of a reissue means that you may never actually have to sit through this one. I believe it's been on YouTube at least once or twice since this time of the recording, but all I can say is that if you want to go out and waste 64 minutes of your life checking this out, then more fool you. It's a totally unmemorable experience. This tape is going in my bottom drawer to be forgotten, and the saddest part is that in 10 to 15 years, when I dig this out again while spring cleaning, I'll probably have forgotten just how dull it was and I'll get to experience the misery all over again.